What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 193. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Hope everybody is either enjoying or had a great Thanksgiving. Got to spend some good time with your family and everything like that. Unfortunately, I don't have a bunch of great news, things we could be thankful for today, but I will be talking about some serious, important news, really hitting on criminal justice. Of course, it always really bothers me that the presidents do this great turkey pardoning thing, like there's no real problems in the U.S. criminal justice system, so we had the time to tinker around pardoning turkeys. But I will talk about some real issues that we have in our criminal justice system: cop killings, people going to jail for ridiculous crimes, and all that kind of stuff. Also got some news on China, Afghanistan, and Africa for today's show. So a lot to cover. Hopefully, this will be a good one. Be sure to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle, for a full archive of my work, including the daily news roundup that I write. I've had 150 plus stories in my news roundups for the past couple of weeks. Tons of great stuff in there. Please check those out. And if you like them, like what you're reading, share it, recommend it, along with the show. And in some ways, those roundups are really like show notes because it has everything that I'm reading in there. So check those out and share those. Also support what we're doing on like YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. Subscribe to the show there. If you're on YouTube, you gotta actually hit the stupid notification bell. It's unbelievable that they do this, but not only do you have to subscribe to the show, but you also have to hit the notification bell, especially if it's like a news show like ours, or else you're not going to get any notifications, or they won't tell you when the show's out. So hit that notification bell, especially if you're on YouTube. And then support you. We take Patreon, subscribe star donations, or you could give us crypto, and the information is in the show notes page. Last way you could support the show, and this way gets you some great products for yourself, and that is doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, wherever you got going on: anxiety, depression, insomnia, or in my case, like back pain, physical pain. CBD products are extremely helpful. They help reduce inflammation. The topicals at Paloma Verde work quick, last a long time. If you got like a little bit more higher level of pain, maybe you need one of the soft gels or the tinctures. They combine it with products like curcumin to help increase the effects of cutting inflation. So a lot of great stuff, a lot of great ways CBD could help you. And the top of the line products are at palomaverdecbd.com. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. That'll get you a discount, and the show will get a kickback. So it's absolutely a great way to support the show. All the information, of course, is in the show notes page. Anywhere you can listen to the show, put the links right in there. Very easy to find. All right, now let's get into it and start talking about these 4 Oklahoma death row inmates that recently lost an appeal at the 10th Circuit Court to have their death sentences overturned, or at least their executions stayed. These 4 men were scheduled to have their executions in the next, I think, 3 months. The most notable in the execution that was first up was Julius Jones. And now I'll talk about him towards the end of this a little bit more. But we also have Wade Lay, Donald Grant, and Gilbert Pastelli. And so the 4 men really seem to base their case around 2 things going on. One, Oklahoma has a very problematic history with lethal injection executions, which is the way that these 4 men are sentenced to die. In 2014, there was one extremely botched execution where I think the inmate like riled around on the bed and convulsed for a solid 45 minutes before actually dying. And then there were also 3 other botched executions. And so this is an issue. It's not quick and clean like people think it is. The person goes, lays there, and then they fall asleep over the course of 10 minutes and their heart stops beating. Very simple and a procedure, everything like that. And they also don't realize that there is a money interest here. These drugs are very expensive. This whole process is very expensive, and there are people who profit off of it, as disgusting as it is. And so I'm not saying that all these four men are guilty, are innocent, excuse me, and they, should be let out of prison. Even in the case of Julius Jones, who I think people are very familiar with because of his story's promotion by Kim Kardashian, that there are real questions about his guilt. But even if there wasn't, even if he wasn't like hotly contesting it or anything like that, there's a real problem with the state having the ability, a legal procedure it could go through to order somebody's execution. Even if in the current way it's sentenced, it's on its way out in some states, even if it's typically only used for murder. And hell, even if you like really believe that it should only be used in cases where we absolutely know the person murdered them, the state is always going to stretch that, and they're always going to lie. I'll talk a little bit later on the show of this guy Kevin Strickland, who was spent 43 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Now he's getting out. Well, thankfully he wasn't sentenced to death 30 something years ago, and now we're talking about exonerating a dead body or something like that, which is so much more shameful. Not that he's going to have a great life now. He's well past the prime where he gets to do all the great things that he would like to do, but at least he can go like visit his mom's grave as a free man, and I think he wants to like go see the ocean or something like that. So anyways, on this case in particular, there is another argument that the inmates are making that's more technical but kind of interesting, where Oklahoma in 2011, I believe, changed their law, and that would be after these men were sentenced, and it changed the way that the lethal injections were carried out, or at least the specificity in the law of it, where I think before it actually said the drug to be used, where it changed it to just by a lethal injection. And they were kind of arguing like a post facto law issue here, where after they were sentenced they changed the law and now they're being sentenced to die in another way, and the court said nah, we don't buy that. So this whole thing is a mess, and I think that the solution will obviously be to get rid of the death penalty, but the state likes to kill and really doesn't, at least largely doesn't want to give up that right. So anyway, I just want to mention Julius Jones, who his execution, I believe, was commuted, and he now actually has a life sentence by Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt. Although, there is some real cruelty, right? Like, if there wasn't like new information that came out 2 days before his execution that caused the governor to decide to stay it, or to commute his sentence, but rather it was just the amount of political pressure that's built up. And so the trauma that you're putting somebody through by pending their own death, and like essentially nobody, a lot of these things go right up till the last minute, and it's only political pressure at the end. And it's just such a cruel and disgusting process. And so, and then the other issue I want to mention in Julius Jones's case in particular is that justice has not been done for him. If we take him off of death row and then just stick him back in jail, and then don't give him an attempt to have another trial to bring up the, I think, very fair concerns in his case, that he may not be guilty, then you're just essentially using him as a human meat bait storage. So because politically that's the most convenient thing to do with him, and that's just morally repulsive and disgusting. All right. Now I want to move on and talk about the case of Andrew Coffey, who has been getting a lot of attention, particularly from right-wing media, and in a way to compare him to Kyle Rittenhouse, saying that, like, hey, look, this is a case of self-defense, and this black man was able to be acquitted of on self-defense grounds. And people saying that if Kyle Rittenhouse was black he wouldn't have gotten away with it. Here's the comparison. Now there's a major problem with this, and that's one of the reasons why I really want to talk about this case. Now, first of all, Andrew Coffey is innocent. didn't commit any crimes. The police broke into his father's house. He was sleeping at the time. They came in on a night raid, throwing flashbang grenades, acting like, they're in Afghanistan. And so he thought he was being robbed, or, the cops don't break into your house at the middle of the night and raid your home. That would be, something criminals would do. And so he fires at what he believes are intruders, which turn out to be police officers. The police officers then return fire, killing Coffey's girlfriend, who I believe was sleeping in the bed with him at the time, Artilleria Woods. And so that is the murder that Coffey was charged with. He didn't actually kill anyone. He was charged with a felony murder because the prosecution alleges that he shot at the cops, and so they charged him with obviously a felony attempted murder there. And so in commission of that felony, the cops then shot his girlfriend, and because of that, Coffey is guilty of murder. And so, again, he's rightfully acquitted of this. This is like pretzel logic to its absolute absurd degree that the state would even try to get a conviction on something like this. But nonetheless, they try to. Now, a little bit more surprising, I guess, is he was acquitted also of the, attempted murder of the police officers for firing at them, which I think is a little bit of a braver decision by the jury, but nonetheless the correct one. Now, he was convicted on a felony firearms charge. I believe he was a felon, or he was staying at his dad's house, who was a felon, one way or the other. Because there was a felon in the house, he shouldn't have had a loaded gun, and so they claim that that is a crime, and he was convicted on that charge, and now faces up to 30 years in jail. 30 years. I mean, this is absolutely crazy, and it's almost just as good as they did find him of a murder. I mean, if you look at cases where, there have been murders, Derek Chauvin is an example. I mean, he isn't going to do 30 years in prison or anything like that. And I'm not saying Coffey will necessarily get the mad sentence here or something, but that possibility is certainly striking and very problematic. And so, well, it is fair to say, and as an example, if somebody were to say to you, like, black men in this country never could use a self-defense argument in court, well, that's not true. It did work for Mr. Coffey, and correctly so, but he actually didn't shoot and kill anybody. And if you believe Kyle Rittenhouse did it out of self-defense, even then you do admit there that he did kill somebody, and that's a huge difference in these two cases. And I don't think it's a very good argument. Now, again, we've done two very thorough breakdowns on this show of the Kyle Rittenhouse case, and I've continued to stick with my position that this kid is not a hero, and it's very problematic that the libertarians have adopted like almost a pro-military. I even confronted somebody on Twitter saying like, "Hey, you sound like a Marine recruiter saying that this 17-year-old should be on the street with the AR-15 to keep the peace." And he said, "Yeah, sometimes that's what's needed." So I obviously really disagree with that. At the same time, he was attacked, and self-defense is self-defense. The law is the law, and I don't think he committed any crimes. And again, shouldn't have been there, everything else, that being said. But I don't think this Coffey or the Kenneth Walker, that is Breonna Taylor's girlfriend, who similarly was not convicted of murder after police broke in on a night raid and tried to kill him and his girlfriend. And, he fought, I think shot one of them. But again, didn't go to jail for it. And while there are comparisons there, between the two, the cops murdering somebody, then pinning it on somebody else, and that somebody else not going to jail for that murder doesn't overlap. I don't think really with the Kyle Rittenhouse case at all. So just wanted to point that out and make the argument there. Now, this next one is astounding. This is from NBC News, and it was done in partnership with Spotlight PA, and so this isn't just like a mainstream media report. It was done with like a lot of local sources as well. It's titled "Pennsylvania Teen Had His Hands Up When He Was Fatally Shot by Police, New Video Shows." So what they have uncovered here is that this Pennsylvania Police Department encountered Christian Hall on December 30th, 2020, standing on a bridge. I saw some video from a different angle. I don't even know if he jumped off this bridge, if he would have died, how serious of a suicide attempt that this was. It seemed that he did have some, standing mental health issues, and so it's not exactly clear to me like how serious of a suicide attempt he was making here. But anyways, as he's standing on the bridge, police start to confront him and I guess try to talk him down. And he then, the police realize that he has what they believe is a gun. It turns out to be a pellet gun. But if I will say from watching the video, it's a very realistic looking pellet gun. And if I had it, I would assume that a cop would assume that was a real weapon, or any person would probably. So, that is a part of this whole story here. However, Hall then steps off of the bridge, and you can see him standing in front of the police officers. I'm actually going to put up the video here. I'm not going to play sound on it because, if people can't see, it's not very helpful. And this is from a news report, and it plays side by side. The video on the left, if you're watching, is the original footage that the police department put out, and the video on the right is the actual footage. And so, for people watching this right now, what you're going to see is Hall standing in front of a police cruiser, maybe 20-25 feet in front of it, with a whole bunch of police behind it. The police then, at some point, open fire on Hall and kill him. But what happens in the initial footage that the police put out is that they blur the screen before you see the cops open fire. And so, the way the human brain works, especially, the way Americans are taught to respect the police, and the police are right, and they just don't kill innocent 19-year-old teenagers holding pellet guns, is that this kid must have pointed the gun at the cops. And the cops have families too. They can't just let some kid shoot them all down and let their kids all grow up orphaned because he was having a mental health episode. So that, that's the narrative that they lay out there for the public to consume first. And now the truth comes out, and that is that he kept his gun in the air the entire time. The police just opened fire and shot him a whole bunch of times, killed the kid. No reason. And it was a straight up murder. And it's almost like the part that's almost more unbelievable and worse is that the cops tried that hard and would go that far to cover it up, that a whole bunch of people saw that video and didn't think, oh my God, we have murderers in our police department. They gunned down a teenager. This is a huge issue. We can't let these people walk around with badges and guns and to, possibly do this again. No, the reaction was to cover it up, to deliberately blur the video, to allow the human mind to kind of jump to conclusions and just trick and deceive the public without actually letting them know they're being tricked and deceived. It's absolutely disgusting, but it's what U.S. police departments do all the time. Now, there's another point to all of this as well, that I really shouldn't have taken this major, media investigation and getting this particular video, because there's another angle of this. And this is why I'm not sure if the kid would have died if he was shot, just because from the other angle, it doesn't look like he would have fallen all that far. But again, it's all a very complicated situation, but you could see from that video that he does not point his gun towards the police officers. But now that it has been reported by the mainstream media, more people, including myself, are now aware of this, which is very important. But there has to be some accountability here, and I think this is a really important story. I want to talk about this in a larger perspective now, right? So we see with Christian Hall that he was, killed by cops, and all the video is there. All the evidence is there. The police reforms from, 5 to 10 years ago, right? We need more body cameras. We need more cameras. That way, when police do things that they shouldn't do, it'll be exposed, and police will be held accountable, and the public will largely see that the police don't go around killing people and beating people up for no reason. Well, what happened is that the police gained access to technology that records us all the time, right? So all these officer body cameras, they're on, which means that there's cameras pointed at anybody who's walking past an officer. Now, I'm not saying that this is happening yet, but I think we're very close to the officers and the technology being developed for them to be able to constantly like have body cameras that have facial recognition and run those against databases, and the cops could like constantly be alerted to anybody walking by them that has like prior convictions or anything like that. Imagine how jumpy the cops are going to be at that point and how many more people they'll be killing. But for right now, the real problem is the body cameras are on the police, but the police have control of the data in almost all cases. So that means if, let's say, a cop shoots somebody, then it's incumbent on the police department to bring that footage unedited to the public to show them what happened and convict one of their fellow officers. As I talked about on the Blue Wall of Silence show, that doesn't happen. Just doesn't happen. Officers don't snitch on each other. If they do, they're filtered out of the system way before they would ever have any chance to have their hands on any of this kind of video, right? So that this is kind of predictable what has happened, and we have an article here from ProPublica about a New York judge that just chastised the New York Police Department for illegally withholding body cam footage in 2 police shootings and operating in bad faith. They've deliberately withheld this video from the public so they couldn't see what happened, including in the case of Kowalski Tranwick, who was at an apartment where like the police came to his apartment. He was having a mental health episode, and they tased him, and that caused him to run at the police, so the police gunned him down. The police officers in the video who actually shot Tranwick were warned by another officer to kind of de-escalate as, they were escalating. And so this is evidence that, this guy didn't need to die. And for that reason, the police covered it up. Now, talking about other ways that police, generate false crimes or stuff like that, and that is through drug testing kits. This is the story from Reason. Cops thought sand from her stress ball was cocaine. She spent nearly 6 months in jail. It's the story of Ju'zema Goldring, and she was, this is just the most unbelievable thing, right? Like the most cartoonish crime that somebody could ever be arrested for is jaywalking, but she was inappropriately arrested for jaywalking. She wasn't in jaywalking. They incorrectly accused her of that and used that to take her into the police station. Once there, they looked through her purse, they cut open a stress ball, and then they tested it using these NARC-2 tests. And several tests later, they produced a positive, and Miss Goldring ends up in prison for 6 months. Now, that sounds absolutely horrible, but you do assume that it took them 6 months to actually run it through an actual testing site. And once they did, they found out that, oh my God, we got it wrong. They called up the judge. They said, hey, judge, that wasn't cocaine. It was sand. The test kit got it wrong. You got to let this girl out of jail. No, they found out 2 months into her 6 months in jail that this what was sand and not drugs, and that there was no reason to hold her in jail. But they continued to anyways. Again, she spent 6 months there. So she's now suing, I think, most of the people involved. And good for her. Hopefully she could actually sue the officers themselves. I believe they did not get qualified immunity by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The officers' name are probably former officer, at least I would hope. Vladimir Henry and Juan Restrepo are the 2 officers. And so there's one other detail in the article, and this one, I guess, kind of goes to, were the officers acting in good faith? They were doing their jobs. Somebody from whoever makes the NART2 field test came in and said, hey, here's what you do. You drop a little bit of the substance in this vial, you shake it up for these many seconds, and if it gives you this color, then they're guilty, and if it gives you this color, then they're innocent. And, you know, that's what the guys did, and it came out wrong, in which case, you know, that there's a little bit of you know, how responsible are they for this? However, what Miss Goldring alleges is that the officers conducted this test multiple times, and I'm sure that they're aware that these tests have strong possibilities of turning up false positives, right? And so if you do it a bunch of times, but not only that, they started doing the field tests inappropriately or incorrectly and generated a false positive. And if that's the case, you know, it's essentially equivalent to kidnapping this woman for 6 months. I mean, she should have been able to go about her life and everything like that. And they, you know, abuse the system to, you know, throw her in a pen for 6 months. All right, now let's talk about prisons themselves. We have this case from Georgia. That last one was from Georgia, too. This one is Antonio May, who was killed by 6 prison guards in the Fulton County Jail. So he was arrested on in September 2018 for throwing rocks at a building. I guess, you know, when they found him, they took him to, I think, the ED or something, and he was confirmed to have amphetamines in his system and was clearly undergoing some kind of mental health episode. Rather than putting him in whatever kind of situation that they would put a person like that in, they went and threw him in a regular cell, which, you know, happens, and whatever. But here's where it really gets nasty. Once he was in his cell, May took off his clothes and exposed himself to officers. In response, 6 deputies went into May's cell, one using a taser on him without warning. A confrontation ensued, after which all 6 deputies tasered, beat, and pepper sprayed him, and this is according to the lawsuit that May's family estate is putting forward. Then the deputies allegedly placed May in a restraining chair and covered his head with a spit mask. And then I guess they tried to wash the pepper spray and whatever else. You know, if they tased him and beat him that much, you know, he could have had, like, you know, if he was naked and stuff, like wet himself or, you know, excrement on himself a little bit. And so now they're spraying him down and he ends up dead. So this is clearly a murder and a torture. It sounds almost like they might have waterboarded him to death a little bit. They put a hood over his head and sprayed him with water. Maybe they were even spraying his face to try to wash off the pepper spray or something like that. And I'm not exactly sure how he died, if he drowned to death or if it was just a combination of pepper spray and somebody throwing a hood over their head and or you have beat them. But now Aaron Cook, Guatel De La Cruz, Omar Jackson, Jason Roach, Keisha Schroeder, and William Whitaker are facing pretty significant jail time. And charged with the murder of Mr. May. And so it's great that this is coming out, but, you know, this is just one murder being charged, and apparently this was at a jail that had Taser Tuesdays. And so I'm guessing Mr. May wasn't the only man that succumbed to beating this way. Another case of false imprisonment, and this one almost more unbelievable than Miss Goldring, was Joshua Speierbach, who was a homeless man who had, I think, some mental health issues, living in Hawaii, you know, on the streets. And he was approached, you know, several times being homeless. This happens a lot. You fall asleep on the streets. The cops come, tap you. Who are you doing? What are you doing here? Get up, move along, something like that. And so one of these times, either maybe because he was tired of being harassed by the cops and want them to go away, or out of like some kind of mental health episode, told the cops that his name was his grandfather's name, William C. Castleberry. So the next couple times he got picked up, I guess they run his name and Castleberry pops up as a possible alias. And then Castleberry is also the name of Thomas Castleberry, who has an arrest warrant out. Now, never mind that Thomas Castleberry is at this time currently in an Alaskan prison, but nonetheless, they I believe figure this out actually with Joshua twice, and then it's the third time that they don't, and they accuse him of being Thomas Castleberry. So as he's pleading to, say I'm not Thomas Castleberry and everything, they admit him to the Hawaiian State Psychiatric Facility, which he had previously been treated. And there they also believe that, or at least say they do, that he is Thomas R. Castleberry, and continue to hold him for 32 months, increasing during this time his dosage of psychiatric medication, alleging that his insistence that his name is actually Joshua Speierbach, which is, who he is, and not Castleberry, is a sign of his psychiatric episode. And I just want to point this out because it really reveals like how nasty the U.S. Mental health system is, and how somebody could be wrongly thrown in a psychiatric hospital and get stuck there. This is a case of false identity. Even when he tried to come, present evidence that isn't who they said he was, and everything. It took several years again for them to figure this out. Where again, Thomas Castleberry, if somebody had bothered to probably check, it probably wouldn't be hard to find out that he was in a jail in the American system. So absolutely terrible. Mr. Or Joshua, I won't try to say his last name again, is actually suing everyone who wrongly held him captive, and hopefully he gets a substantial amount of money and causes people to really consider what they're doing, when they're keeping people in jail forever. The Elijah Mcclane story, which we have followed a lot here on Conflicts of Interest, breaking down how police and EMTs worked together to kill this young man for absolutely no reason with a massive dose of ketamine. His family has successfully settled with, I believe, the city of Aurora, not like the entire state of Colorado, but the city of Aurora, which is like adjacent to Denver, for $15 million. Now, as always, happy the family is getting paid. That they obviously suffered a loss that should not have happened. At the same time, I do wish that more of the financial responsibilities was falling on those who actually carried out the crime and not the taxpayer at large. But again, the taxpayers allow all this to happen, so it's not a huge probably penalty to the individual citizens, and in some way vaguely a little bit of justice happening here. I think the real justice in the Mcclane case, though, is the fact that the first responders have been charged, and hopefully will go to jail for Elijah's murder. The Department of Justice has settled with 16 of the 17 families of victims of the Parkland shooting. So not one of the families of one of the kids that was, murdered by Nicholas Cruz in Parkland was, for whatever reason, declined to enter this lawsuit. So the other 16 families will split in some way the $130 million. It says there's 40 survivors here, so it may also include some people who are either injured or somehow traumatized in this event. But anyways, one of the families was not involved in this lawsuit, just pointing that out. But the reason that the DOJ is paying out is because someone close to Nicholas Cruz warned the FBI pretty close to the actual time of the shooting that this kid was going to take a gun and shoot up a school, and the FBI really failed to follow through and do their jobs. And one of the reasons I want to bring this up is from every perspective here, the criminal justice system, the U.S. law enforcement system did not protect these kids. If it, did what it was supposed to do, not that I necessarily agree with everything that it's supposed to do, but if it actually functioned correctly, this should have been a preventable crime. Also, maybe less kids would have died had the cops not, hung out outside too, scared to go into the building. And so you essentially have a situation where, the police pretend that we have to let them kill a whole bunch of people in order to protect kids from being shot up at schools. But when, somebody actually wants to shoot up a school, the police don't do anything to stop it anyways. Recently, we had the Groveland 4 exonerated in Florida. These are 4 black men who were charged with rape in 1949. They have all since passed away and actually had previously been pardoned, I believe, by DeSantis in 2019, but whoever the governor of Florida was then. And they, they're out, which is, are not, they're not out, but their name has officially in law by all the butts now been cleared. And so, for the any survivors that they have, and just, for justice in general, this is a nice little token, but it's just another example of all these people who have been wrongly persecuted by the U.S. government forever, and how long it takes them to get something right. I mean, we're talking about 72 years later, the state is finally really admitting to what happened here. Want to focus a little bit more, though, on Kevin Strickland, who I talked about on the show in the past. He's now spent 43 years in a Missouri prison for a crime that he didn't commit. He was convicted of a triple murder by a all-white jury, sentenced to life in prison, of course, in 1979, and, maintained his innocence all along. His guilt was mainly... the people believed he was guilty mainly because of the testimony of one witness, Cynthia Douglas, who was actually injured in the killing. So she was hanging out with the 3 other murder victims when these people came in and execution style killed the other 3. She was shot in the leg and pretended to be dead. And then after they left, she was able to escape. Once she escapes, she goes to the police. The police give her a lineup. Apparently, she's no longer alive, but from statements that she had given to several family members, when she was brought into the lineup, she still had the brain matter and blood of her friends on her. So you can imagine that this probably isn't the person who is going to maybe make the easiest decision. And they also say that the police prompted her to pit Strickland and saying that, she could leave and put this all behind her if she did. And so if the way you get your friend's brain matter off your face is by pointing and saying that guy did it, that's probably what you're going to do. And that's the cops, that the position that the cops put Miss Douglas in. And that, of course, led to probably the majority of Mr. Strickland's life being absolutely wasted in a prison. How many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of taxpayer dollars went to his prosecution and to his imprisonment all these years when he could have been a productive member of society. All these kinds of things, extremely disturbing. Fortunately, though, he now gets out of prison. Hopefully the state of Missouri will owe him a massive chunk of money. I'm guessing that absolutely none of it, unfortunately, will come from the people who are responsible for incorrectly putting him behind bars. But he shouldn't have to really work or anything, struggle for a living, and just maybe do some enjoyable things. I think he said he wants to visit his mother's grave and go see the ocean. Facebook is telling the Los Angeles Police Department to stop making fake accounts after it came out that the police department was making a lot of fake accounts in order to surveil essentially whoever they wanted. This is absolutely awful that the LAPD is doing this, but in no way to me comes to a surprise. And if anything, I think the lesson from this really shouldn't be that we gotta find some way to stop the police from making fake accounts on Facebook. Just assume that the government is taking everything off of Facebook anyways, and when I first had Facebook, there was a lot of people that were like, well, if you don't like what I have to say, get off my wall. And that was, the way you looked at it, that it was almost like a private thing you had that people could come check out, where, now the police are just running all over Facebook, and there's every reason to assume that if, you get a new friend request from a name you don't recognize, it's potentially a cop trying to peek in and see what everybody is up to. Another thing going on in American prisons is that there's been a months-long labor feud between the Bureau of Prisons and its main labor union. And this labor dispute, the lack of a contract, is preventing a key part of the First Step Act from going in place, which would allow tens of thousands of inmates to access programs that reduce recidivation and then get time earned credits to get out of jail sooner. And so it's absolutely insane that this is going on. Inspector General Michael Horowitz says that the Bureau of Prisons is mainly responsible for the logjam here. The BOP is claiming that they can have in-person negotiations with the union. The union is saying that we have to have in-person negotiations. And Horowitz is saying that the BOP using COVID to cover this up is absolute garbage and shouldn't count. The Department of Justice is providing $139 million to police departments, local police departments, to hire more than 1,000 new officers. The money will go to 183 different police departments for 1,066 police officers. This is part of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services COPS hiring program. And since the office began in 1994, it has given out more than $14 billion of our taxpayer dollars to hire more road pirates to steal and abuse us. The IRS announced that it seized $3.5 billion in cryptocurrency. That's 93% of the money that the IRS seized in 2020, and it's coming in crypto. And this seems to be a part of a major push from the IRS, where they expect another multi-billion-dollar seizure year in 2021. I think this is actually would be looking at fiscal year 2022, and the 3.5 billion would be from fiscal year 2021, which I think by the U.S. government ends in October. And so all this money that the IRS is getting through crypto and seizing it seems that they're getting more powers to monitor and regulate crypto. And so my guess is that, once they realize how much money there is to be made here, it's not that they're going to stop seizing a whole bunch of crypto. They're just going to steal more and more of it. And, if you're a big Bitcoin guy, you probably want to start to look at ways to make sure you could protect yourself from the thieves at the IRS. Last story here. It probably isn't a big one, but just wanted to mention that Attorney General Merrick Garland directs federal prosecutors try to prioritize cases of air travel assault. And, in the past year and a half through the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of attention paid to what's happening in the air. Now, I'm not sure how much, these incidents on airplanes are actually up, or actually why, if people really just get so upset that they're having to wear a mask, that they're assaulting flight attendants, or if there's other things going on here. Flying's very anxiety provoking for a lot of people, especially on airplane. It could be very hard to hear when somebody is talking to you with a mask on, with all the other ambient noise, and not being able to read the person's lips at all. Maybe it could be people who aren't wearing masks at all, then put on a mask, get on a plane, they have to wear one for 5-6 hours. Maybe they have a little less oxygen, less critical thinking. They're a little bit more aggressive or volatile for that reason. But nonetheless, the Department of Justice is going to start to prioritize these cases. So be careful what you're doing on airplanes. I'm guessing the flight attendants are going to be even more aggressive and empowered now. Few stories on Afghanistan. ISIS-K continues to, carry out some attacks. I don't want to, I think the mainstream media makes a lot of this, but, weekly at least, ISIS-K is hitting targets around Afghanistan. Lots of civilians. Recently, Afghan journalist Hamid Shahani was killed on a bus along with 6 other people. It's unclear if he was the target or if this just happened to be an attack within the Shiite community that happened to kill a journalist. The Taliban have made an effort. I think they're now deploying 1,300 fighters to eastern Afghanistan, mainly in the Nangarhar province, to wage war against ISIS-K there. Not sure how effective these fighters are going to be if the surge in ISIS-K attacks is due to just the Taliban being in control, or if, and former fighters of the Afghan government flowing into the hands of ISIS-K, things like that going on, or if in part the Taliban's takeover and how oppressive they've been in their takeover. I think people feel though they promised more than they actually gave out as far as power sharing and all of that is encouraging some of the ISIS insurgency, as well as talked about on the show all the time. The more heavy-handed you are, the more you're going to provoke an insurgency. We did have 100 members of Iskp surrendered to the Taliban government, and so that could be maybe this organization becoming overwhelmed, or people who signed up for it and then didn't want to remain members or something, leaving and looking to join the Taliban, or getting out before they're massacred or something like that. The Taliban say they will begin paying government workers. I'm unclear exactly. I know the Taliban have dismissed people, that women have been dismissed from various jobs in Afghanistan, and so my kind of guess from reading the story here, which was published at the Times of India, is that the Taliban are going to pay people who are currently working in the government for their work now and the past 3 months. Obviously, for the Taliban, there are some real accounting issues that they had to deal with once they took over. Before even the Taliban expected to take over, the international money instantly dried up. So you had millions of people paid that were no longer getting paid, and sanctions preventing it from happening. That being said, the way the Taliban have doled out the government since they've been in charge, I think suggests to me that this is largely going to benefit people who are loyal to the Taliban, which is the way the U.S. operated, by the way, when it was in charge of Afghanistan too. There was a Red Cross official that traveled to Afghanistan and was absolutely livid with the conditions created by the international community, mainly blaming sanctions and the lack of aid to Afghanistan, saying that 20 million people are going to go hungry this winter and kids are starving. They do not have food to eat, and this is all being caused by the international community. As bad of a political move as it would be for Joe Biden, as much heat as he would take from the Republicans to allow the Taliban to have access to the Afghan government funds and to remove sanctions from the Taliban, how much of a political win would you be willing to take to starve children to death? And that's really the question that Joe Biden is facing right here. And honestly, I think Joe Biden would be willing to starve hundreds of thousands of children to death in order to not take some criticism from the Republican Party over Afghanistan. Not that there's that many Afghan children potentially at risk this winter, but there's a lot, and the U.S. isn't going to do anything about it because the Taliban are bad, and because the Taliban are bad, and that's the U.S. slogan, anything that would remotely help anybody living within Afghanistan can happen, even if that just meant lifting sanctions. So if our European partners were absolutely disgusted by people starving to death, that they could provide that kind of aid. there are 28,000 Afghans seeking temporary entrance into the U.S. That have actually applied, and the U.S. has only approved 100 of those applications so far. And so while we got a lot of talk from the Biden administration about welcoming Afghans into the U.S., I'm not quite sure that they're so willing to follow through with it. There's also an issue of about 200 people who were evacuated from Afghanistan who are now in Kosovo who cannot pass, or somebody within their family cannot pass the U.S. vetting process, and so they are currently in a limbo state, and the U.S. is seriously consider sending them back to Afghanistan. This is something that I was talking about during the withdrawal that I thought was going to be a major issue. Is you're going to have people that are going to get on these planes, and once they get on the planes, they're going to say, well, I can't go back because my life will be in danger. And in some respect, I think that's a really, really fair argument to make, that they could be in danger from the Taliban if they're sent back. However, they're not going to, and maybe shouldn't, pass the vetting system set up by the United States to allow them into the U.S. And so now you have somebody who's essentially stateless, and this was created by the Afghan war and the chaotic U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan. Now, the U.S. announced this week new sanctions against the leadership of Iskp in Afghanistan. So, we hate ISIS, we hate the Taliban, although it would kind of seem that if we weren't sanctioning the Taliban and allowed them to act more like a normal country that the U.S. just had a relationship with, not like Saudi Arabia, not like Israel, just like a normal, regular country that, we allowed to trade with. Anybody who wants to trade can. We could, give some aid, help out. They are a poorer country, stuff like that. And, a lot of the Afghanistan being poor, and a lot of the damage in infrastructure caused in the country for the last 20 years, that the response is responsible to, America. So, there's a lot of reasons the U.S. should help out there beyond just sanctioning Iskp, and how that could probably help the Taliban fight against the group. Let's see. Last thing to mention here is that the new U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, stepped down. The new guy is Tom West, is going to be traveling to Qatar for talks with the Taliban. Initially here in the Hill was reported to be in Afghanistan, but actually the talks will be occurring in Qatar and not Afghanistan. The Taliban have put out some very strong signals that they're very excited for those talks and think that some kind of progress could be made. I'm not sure why. I'm nowhere near as optimistic as the Taliban leadership, but maybe there's been some kind of communication or some kind of promises made by the U.S. that the Taliban thinks that the U.S. is going to follow through with. All right, that's what I have on Afghanistan. I think the situation there looks really, really bleak. Very unfortunate for the Afghans who had suffered under the U.S. war for so long, and now an absolute humanitarian crisis after we wrecked that country and are, actively preventing anybody from trying to make anything any better. Few stories on China here. The Philippines warns China that they have a mutual defense pact with the U.S. and shouldn't be meddling around in Philippines claimed territory. Now, this is really interesting because a couple of years ago, the Philippines actually tried to make an effort to pivot towards China and away from the U.S. And when that didn't work out, they, came back and are pivoting back towards the U.S. But now they're using the U.S. to threaten China. And this seems like one of the countries where I put in a category like Turkey, where there's so many human rights violations within the country with Duterte's drug war. There's all these other territorial disputes that are fairly complicated. And the best situation for it would be for the U.S. to, again, treat the Philippines like a normal country. We had trade with the Philippines. Filipinos could come visit America, move to America, whatever. Doesn't matter, but we shouldn't pledge to defend the Scarborough Shore for the Philippines over, in a war against China. And that's what the Philippines is asking us to do. The U.S. has moved more troops into Taiwan in the past year. The number of troops that are usually there has doubled from 20 to 40, according to this report from Foreign Policy. And this, by the way, comes after Joe Biden had a virtual summit, and not an actual one, with Chinese President Xi. And so this was a chance, for the U.S. to like maybe improve its relationship with China a little bit. But after, the U.S. meeting with Xi, the U.S. sent an invitation to Biden's Summit of Democracies. I think they invited like representatives from 109 countries, and then also Taiwan being 110. But not Russia, China, and other countries. And so, the whole thing is just so silly. Even the Washington Post is reporting that the U.S. supports the majority of the world's dictators. And it's, and this idea that Russia and China stand for authoritarianism and aggression on autocracy, and it's the U.S. that stands for democracy, and we have to promote that. And, not realizing that, let's say, the U.S. sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and all these other countries where, the situation, the human rights situation is absolutely atrocious. These are absolute monarchies, right? And there's no like recognition of that whatsoever. And really what it is, it's just Cold War rhetoric, right? What they're trying to do is they're trying to give Americans a dividing line, a very clear propaganda line. We're good, we're democratic, they're bad, they're authoritarianism. You're either with us, with the democracies, or you're with them, with the authoritarianism. It was that communists and capitalists. It's the same thing. They're trying to roll it out again. Please don't fall for it. Anyways, with this particular summit, again, it's really just used to stoke tensions with China and Russia at this point. The U.S. also sailed a warship through the Taiwan Strait. I don't know how many. We're well over 10 in the past year, and I think we're maybe on 11 or 12 just for Biden now. It was a guided missile destroyer, the USS Millis, and I'm not sure what the point of this is, to continue to operate these exercises and stuff like that. The U.S. will say, "Oh, we're showing China that the Taiwan Strait has to be open to transit, and the dividing line between China and Taiwan and all this other stuff." It means absolutely nothing. China isn't prepared or isn't preparing to invade Taiwan, and the only thing that's making China have more of a military buildup in that direction is the fact that the U.S. is militarily building with Taiwan and increasingly threatening China all the time about a slew of issues. So real issue here. Taiwan will be increasing its defense spending, but only by 8.6 billion over the next 5 years. I think U.S. senators have discussed giving Taiwan $1 billion a year, which really isn't all that far off of the mark that this massive spending, according to for Taiwan, is happening. So I think it just goes to show exactly how concerned Taiwan is with with the China threat overall, that they're really not spending that much on their military at this point. And a lot of what they buy are U.S. weapons, and it seems more like they're just trying to buy favorability from the U.S. Than weapon systems at times. Let's see. The U.S. began a new set of war games off of Japan's southern coast in the Philippine Sea with Canada, Germany, Australia, and Japan. This is another major escalation and, sign to China that the U.S. is trying to rally a Cold War type alliance. You have a European, a North American ally, and then two allies from the region, but, very differently, China and Japan, all working together in anti-China military drills. Now, the next article I have has a couple really interesting things in it. The first, it's pointing out here that the U.S. is, with the AUKUS treaty, going to be increasing its air and space ties with Australia, which, shouldn't come as a real surprise. The U.S. is going to help them build nuclear submarines. Why not help them build missiles or something else? But in this article from Air Force Magazine, which is an independent 501c3, although if you look at their website, they got Air Force sponsorship all over it, so I assume they get a great amount of money from the Air Force. But right in here, the first line is, Australia is declaring its allegiance to the global rules-based order, And that says, and then it says, the U.S. Defense Department's code for keeping China in check. And so it's just, this is one of the most blatant admissions that I've seen from somebody getting pretty close to the Pentagon, just openly admitting the whole global rules based order isn't about like rule of law, isn't about keeping Russia in check because they're a bad country, or, taking on China because they violate human rights and threaten sovereignty and all this kind of stuff. It's really just about the new Cold War, code and slogans and all that. And the rules based world order is just anti China policy. Simple as that. So there is this Chinese tennis player who I, previous to this, had never heard of, although I'm not like a big fan of tennis. I know like the name of 3 tennis players, I think. But this particular woman is Payne Shui, and she accused a high-ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party of some sort of sexual assault. I didn't look at all the details, and if I'm understanding, he was alleged to have done more to her. I apologize, but it's some sort of sexual crime committed against her. I have no reason to doubt her. A government official taking advantage of his position and abusing an athlete wouldn't surprise me at all, and it's not like we haven't heard of Larry Nassar or anything like that before. That makes me question this at all. However, after she made this claim towards the beginning of November, she hadn't made a public appearance for about 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, and there started to be calls from, I think at first, like maybe concerned tennis players. It could have been, I don't know how this all started. Maybe it was facilitated in some way, or maybe, her friend was like, hey, I haven't heard from my friend in a couple weeks, so I'm going to put something out on Twitter because it's kind of weird. And, she just made this claim against, this government figure. And so hopefully, she's not being like silenced, or there's not some kind of repercussion against her. Well, it's piled very quickly. And when you have the world's all top tennis players and some sports figures calling for her to like be able to make some kind of public statement and everything like that, of course, this was happening literally 2 days after Gavin Newsom made his public appearance after a booster shot in 10 days without being in public at all, and everybody being called an insane conspiracy. I didn't talk about it on the show. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. However, I did see people losing their absolute minds, calling people conspiracy theorists for wondering if, maybe he had some kind of side effects or what was going on, because the governor had been very public before that. And here you have people wildly speculating that the Chinese party had killed her or was torturing her, all this other kind of stuff. And it's like, maybe there's a realm for especially private people to call for her, hey, like, can you make a public statement in case she is in a situation where she is in some kind of danger. It may put some public pressure on the Chinese government to release her from that. We saw something not 100% dissimilar, but on like a different level with French President Mcclane and the then Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, when he was being essentially held captive in Saudi Arabia. And so, I'm not saying that this is completely ridiculous or couldn't help somebody's safety at all, but it did seem to be quite a change where in one day the U.S. media was, oh my God, you can't speculate why somebody is not in the public, to, oh my God, why isn't somebody in the public the next day? The U.S. White House also made a demand for proof of life. That's where I think that this, jumps a little bit far, and it actually makes it seem political to me, and not concerned about her safety at all. Now, she has been in public twice, and I guess, you could put some air quotes around in public or something like that, because the events were, I believe, covered by like the Chinese state media. And so some people are saying that, oh, this really doesn't count. And I can see in a way that you can make that argument. But at the same time, if there was like some U.S. woman who the lady who accused Joe Biden, right? If the Chinese were saying it's been 12 days since she spoke in the public, where is she? Did Joe Biden's goon silence her? Obviously, people would like roll their eyes and think that this gets a little ridiculous and political at some point. And so, she's been in public. And I'm not quite sure what the play here is, but the Americans are trying to roll this into a boycott of the Chinese Olympics, and Biden is apparently considering it at this point. Now, not a full-on boycott where we wouldn't even send athletes or like an official delegation, I guess, at all, but this would make it so like no U.S. officials are officially attending the Olympic Games as representatives of the U.S. government. So Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, senators and stuff like that wouldn't be attending the Olympic Games. This is, I mean, disappointing because the Olympics were meant to, provide or I don't know about meant, but could be used to provide a platform for diplomacy. That's, what Ron Paul always talks about. Sports are a great way to break down some, real diplomatic intense issues. And while I'm not saying that going to resolve all the world problems if Joe Biden goes to the Olympic Games, but having a diplomatic boycott of it does show that the U.S. Is, trying to like enter a new Cold War with China. We also have the U.S. Congress calling on China to, the Congress is calling on the Olympic Committee to press China on human rights abuses. And, again, China commits human rights abuses. If the Olympic Committee didn't want to hold the Olympic Games in a country where there were human rights abuses, well, they probably couldn't hold it in America then either, but I would support that. Why the hell? But it shouldn't be the role of the American Congress to make that decision. And overall, I don't think the Olympic Committee is going to move China on this. Now, the other problem I have is, again, this is all for show, right? So if the U.S. really wanted to rein in a human rights abuser who was doing cruel things to its citizens in preparation for international international sporting event, then maybe we shouldn't be looking at China, where we have essentially no, like minor influence. Maybe we do have large economies that are tied together, but Qatar is essentially an American proxy state, and they recently arrested 2 Norwegian journalists who were attempting to cover the conditions that the migrant workers in Qatar, who are building the facilities for the FIFA 2022 World Cup, were building, and they were arrested, I think held for 30 hours and had their footage destroyed. And so it seems that, if the U.S. was really concerned, we could say no more weapon sales to Qatar until they make sure that all the like Filipino and Pakistanis who are building all these FIFA stadiums are paid and, not living in squalor and not treated like third class citizens, which they of course are. And we also had Qatar hiring a former CIA officer to actually spy on FIFA officials to get the World Cup bid in the first place. And this just is a part of something that we've seen several Middle East states do, including the UAE, to a far more nefarious end in Yemen, where they actually hired former either U.S. intelligence or special forces to go out and kill a bunch of political leaders in Yemen. But this is still troubling that, they're spying on different countries and FIFA leaders, former CIA members on behalf of the Qatari government. Real quick here on hypersonics before we move on. The Space Force General David Thompson, I don't think he's the head of the agency, warned that China and Russia were moving ahead of the U.S. on hypersonics. My feeling on this is that the race for hypersonics isn't all that militarily important. Where it is really important is on the budget sheet, and we're also seeing that not only just for developing the weapons, and so saying China and Russia are ahead means Congress is going to go, oh my God, how many billions of dollars does the Pentagon need to make sure that China doesn't have more advanced hypersonic weapons than us? But also they're going to build space-based systems to prevent and track hypersonic weapons. Now, This is absolutely crazy on several levels. We're weaponizing space, which we should be moving and trying to develop treaties to do the opposite on that and demilitarize space. But also, I think another really key issue on all this is just how much missile defense costs. And if we're going to try to put this technology in space, it's probably could potentially be what ends up bankrupting the American empire. When we're talking about the billions of dollars is going to be required to put these kind of systems into space, and they're probably not going to work all that well if we're being honest. All the U.S. Hawkishness against China and Russia has continued to push the two countries closer together. And this is the last story I have on China here. Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com writes, citing U.S. threats, China and Russia agreed to expand military cooperation. And, there's nothing very specific in here. It's not like, oh, we're now allies against the American empire. But it's another step. It's more strategic partners. It's more training together. It's more shared military project. It's more joint patrols, more actions together in the Pacific Ocean and stuff like that. And while the U.S. could hold good relationships with both Russia and China because neither really threatened the U.S. and essentially allow the negative relationship between those two, the issues between those two countries to come to like the fore and be the main problems, we consistently make ourselves the main issue for both Russia and China. All right, a few stories on Africa today before I wrap up. General stories here. In the Senate NDAA, there is a whole bunch of funding that is targeted at African militaries, and the idea is to establish deeper ties between the U.S. militaries and the African militaries to prevent those militaries from cooperating more with Russia and China. I think that this is a generated threat that, yeah, China and Russia, like most countries, are looking to Africa as developing nations. They have resources, and there's a lot of people that live there. So they're not only markets for our products, but are potential places where we could either get resources in an ethical way, not in like the old we're just going to steal it way, or like they manufacture things there and people buy them. There's a lot of great things that could happen from Africa developing more economically for everybody on the planet. But what the U.S. is really concerned about is that if, these nations are more allied with China or something like that, or they have really strong economic ties with China, then they're not going to want to buy U.S. military weapons because that could, hurt their economic relationship with China if the U.S. is in a Cold War with China. And so the idea here, I think, is to essentially get in on the ground floor in Africa, make sure that all these countries' militaries are beefed up, right? So that, they're essentially either in control or an immovable force. So even if the country has like a strong civilian government or something like that, it really couldn't do anything against the military, or it couldn't do anything that the military did. It would have to consider the military as its own entity that's potential to take over the country at any time it wants, and it kind of has to placate the military. And if all the military equipment is American, it's going to cause these countries to continue to buy American made products because the military equipment is really expensive. And so if you're buying new products from Russia, it's going to cost more than just simply buying the new missiles or parts you need from the US. And so I think that is a lot of the goal here with this bill. Of course, is coming all at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer dollar. Now, one of the consequences to this, which of course the U.S. government pretends like it isn't, is there's growing militant groups in Africa, and you really have to wonder if the U.S. giving more tanks and military planes to governments, in Nigeria and Ethiopia, if that is in part stoking the increased hostilities and more militant groups in those countries that are carrying out insurgencies and asymmetrical warfare. The main military in these countries is looking to project more power. This is producing more extremism, as Anthony Blinken would label it. Although I think in a lot of times, when they say like extremism when it comes to Africa, it's they're really stretching to tie it into the international terrorism threat that doesn't exactly correlate. Boko Haram or Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, was Islamic State Western Africa Province, IS-WASP. All these groups, even Al Shabaab, maybe they'll carry out regional attacks, but they're really not international terrorist groups. And so, this is a way to say, oh my God, we need to, fund these militaries to prevent the terrorism, when really it's probably the funding of the militaries that's causing the terrorism. And again, we have from Dave DeCamp here at antiwar.com with Antony Blinken's recent 3-nation Africa trip. He went to Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. The main statement, the main message of that trip was China bad, do business with the U.S. only. And so now I want to take a minute and look at 3 countries in Africa where there's some real instability going on, important news stories. The first is Ethiopia. So it was last November that war broke out there, and I have really tried to do some research and try and nail down exactly what happened at the start of this war. And we ran a really good article at antiwar.com this past week from the War Nerd on it that was pretty solid, where it seems about right, where the people in Tigray, which is in northern Ethiopia, they had long been in control of the Ethiopian government, and then a new government was elected and came in, led by Abiy Ahmed, and that government was not Tigrayan, and so for whatever reason, the TPLF was, I think, probably correctly convinced that they were going to have a conflict with the Ethiopian government. In their conviction of that, they carried out a first strike against the Ethiopian bases in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. But then, rather than like trying to push it and take the capital city, the leadership and largely the TPLF melted away, understanding that they could launch an initial attack and destroy a whole bunch of military equipment, but they couldn't really wage a full frontal war, at least at the time, against the Ethiopian government. Now, it seems like this maybe caused more people within the Ethiopian military and government which had historically been Tigrayan, to defect to the Tigrayan side. And I wonder if the Ethiopian government encouraging, ethnic militias, and specifically the Eritrean, which borders Ethiopia over the Tigrayan region to the north, if encouraging the Eritrean army to come in, which did commit some pretty horrible abuses in Tigray, prompted maybe more people to, who were Tigrayan but a part of the Ethiopian government, to defect sides. At this point, it seems the Ethiopian military is on the run from the TPLF, which over the course of 6, 8, 9 months from November, after the Ethiopian military was able to like push in and take the Tigray region and occupy it, then once the Tigray forces switched to occupation, they were able to drive out the Ethiopian government and occur a whole bunch of losses, including one of the best units, I believe, one of the Ethiopian government's best armor units was lost in a key battle through all of this. And so now this has created a situation where we're starting like October, September. It seemed that the Ethiopian government sounded very concerned about how much progress the TPLF, the Tigrayan forces, were making towards the capital. And this particular week, we even have the leader, Abiy Ahmed, at least he's reported by his governments to have gone to the front lines of the battlefront as the TPLF is closing in closer to the capital of Ethiopia. Now, there's been a lot of war crimes and just general human rights abuses reported on all sides of this thing. The ethnic militias of the Amhara region, there's been accusations there. There's been Amoromo, which is another ethnic group, where there's been like abuses against different ethnic groups in Tigray. The Ethiopian and the Eritrean militaries are accused of carrying out human rights abuses. The Tigrayan forces are accused of carrying out massacres and everything. The UN seems to have a somewhat well documented case here that at least 1,000 people have been detained since Ethiopia declared the state of the emergency, and almost everybody who's been detained has been Tigrayan, and some of these people do work for the UN. The US seems to be taking the side of the TPLF, or at least against the Ethiopian military. It has sanctioned the Eritrean military for their role in what they did in Tigray, and is also demanding and putting all the pressure on Abe to deal with the situation in Tigray and to bring an end to the conflict, when it seems like you can at least also point to the TPLF, or at least be making the same demands out of them, but that's not happening. Last thing to note here is that Antony Blinken says that the U.S. is prepared, and we have moved special operation forces to the major U.S. base in Djibouti. I believe that's Camp Luminaire, one of our largest bases actually overseas. And those special forces soldiers would be responsible for evacuating the embassy should the TPLF threaten it for any reason, or I guess like the capital city was going to fall, or hell, even I guess the Ethiopian government could threaten the U.S. embassy. On October 25th in Sudan, there was a military coup. I have talked about this a little bit on the show in the past, and now that coup has a little bit at least been undone. So what happened was the Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok was, in charge of Sudan for, I would say, like the past year or so. Of course, the longtime dictator there in 2018, 2019, Bashir was overthrown. You end up with a brief time where the military was in control, and then protests eventually leads the military to hand over, at least in some large respects, control over to the civilian population. And I'm not exactly sure what the breaking point was that caused the military to then perform another coup and remove Hamdok from power. But the protesters, once that happened, went out into the streets, and then I think 40 or 41 demonstrators were killed in this series of protests, including some children. But a month later, he was returned to power. Now, the U.S. right now is saying that even though he has been returned to power, and that the U.S. had ended that the U.S. had cut off the aid, I think about $700 million it was planning to give to Sudan. It has not announced it was going to restart that aid, even though Hamdok was returned to power. Now, the last thing I'll mention is apparently the Prime Minister has lost some support during all this from the people, and are a little bit upset about the deal that he took to return to power. Now, I don't understand all the grievances of the protesters, so I really don't understand what their issue with the deal is at this point. But apparently his popularity has fallen some since accepting the deal, seeing it maybe either as a sign of weakness or caving, and that the protesters were willing to, fight more in the streets for more concessions, or maybe they're looking to hold the military responsible for the coup, trying to prevent another one from happening. So back to civilian government, it seems, in Sudan, and congratulations to the Sudanese people who have staged some major protests and been brutalized a few times over the past years, but have actually been able to move their government in a somewhat less militaristic and authoritarian direction, at least a little bit at some time. So that's better than a lot of people do. Talking about Libya real quick before I wrap up here, the UN envoy to Libya abruptly resigned this past week. His resignation will be effective December 10th. And I saw two reasons given for this resignation. One, the official one, was that they wanted to change the way the post was formatted, and so his resignation allows for that to happen. And then the second reason was there was a political issue between the envoy and I believe the leader of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and that led to his resignation. Honestly, the second explanation makes a hell of a lot more sense because we are now less than a month out from Libya's coming presidential elections. The date is December 24th. They didn't pick Christmas Eve. They picked Libya's Independence Day for that vote. The UN has largely backed this vote. And so that's why I think it's fairly significant that the UN envoy is resigning, as I'm sure he had a pretty large role in putting this whole thing together. Now, in total, 98 people tried to run for president of Libya, but the Electoral Commission ruled out 25 of them, including the son of the former Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. His name is Saif al-Islam, and he is somebody we've talked about on the show quite a bit over the past several years, as the U.S. had an opportunity in 2011 to really just switch Gaddafi's. Well, Saif al-Islam, his last name is Islam, not Gaddafi, but, he was really ready to depose and take over for his father in 2011, but the U.S. decided instead to go ahead with the NATO-led war there, depose Gaddafi, and predictably created a failed state, which continues to claim lives. Just this week, 10 migrants were found dead in a boat off of Libya's coast. Hundreds of thousands of people have died trying to cross from Libya into Europe. It's absolutely insane the amount of death that this war has brought. And it all seemed preventable and everything. But there did seem to be some popular encouragement for Saif al-Islam in his candidacy. However, him being ruled out makes me wonder how legitimate these elections will be viewed overall. Also, another major name and candidate is Khalifa Haftar, who has been the military man in control of most of eastern Libya for the past decade. Probably 8 years now. I don't think he came to Libya right in 2011 after Gaddafi was deposed, but he has controlled a huge chunk of Libya with his military rule, and is pretty credibly accused, and his forces are credibly accused of committing war crimes. And so if you're outlawing Saif al-Islam for potential crimes that he committed while his father was in charge of Libya like 10 plus years ago, it seems like you also have to address anybody who's been involved in crimes in Libya. And I mean, we're talking about millions of deaths and rapes in the past 10 years. Who knows? I'm sure anybody who's actually running for president, most of them are, with like power, authority, money, followers and stuff, are guilty of committing crimes. And it seems maybe a little bit arbitrary to rule out Saif al-Islam. Anyways, my major concern is that this will undermine the what would be for the Libyans, not for the international community, but for the Libyans, if they don't have the people that they want running in the presidential election, then it might feel illegitimate to them and not actually be something that brings about a peace, stability, an acceptable government, but rather would bring about a situation of more chaos and fighting, and maybe fracturing of different divisions and stuff like that. Elections could be a good thing and a good way to pick a leader, maybe, but it doesn't really work if the country is broken and has far more problems than just not being able to elect a leader. And it seems like Libya has still far more problems. Now, the UN Security Council is threatening sanctions against anybody who meddles in the election. I'm sure everybody's going to meddle in the election anyways. And since, everybody has a benefactor on the UN Security Council that's a permanent member state, whether it's Russia, the US, China, France, the UK, my guess is that no sanctions actually come, even if one country does try to influence the election quite a bit. All right, everybody, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody's enjoying it. Keep sharing the show. Keep supporting the show. I appreciate it so much. Everybody enjoy your Thanksgiving, and we'll be back with more shows next week.